All right, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Before we get started, we'll have a couple of housekeeping items for folks. So as you're coming in, um, please make sure that you are looking at the chat as well. We'll be sharing some of that as well. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Valdez, Chief External Affairs Officer with Welcoming America. Um, we want to make sure that you all are aware that this webinar is being recorded, that all registrants will receive the full recording. We also want to remind folks that AI recording bots will be removed, that the chat box is for platform or technical questions, and then we have a Q&A feature for content questions. So please make sure as you have any questions that you put them in the Q&A. If there are any technical questions, please use the chat box. We'll be monitoring that as well. With that, we will go ahead and get started. Again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Valdez, Chief External Affairs Officer at Welcoming America, and I'm really honored to kick off this event on behalf of Welcoming America. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, Welcoming America is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to creating inclusive communities where everyone, including immigrants and refugees, can thrive. We work with local governments, nonprofits, and community organizations across the country to foster a culture of inclusion, ensuring that immigrants, refugees, and newcomers are welcomed and have the opportunity to fully participate in the civic, cultural, and economic life of their local communities. We're here today to discuss the launch of the Connective Tissue Policy Framework, which offers a new perspective on how policy can play a critical role in fostering community inclusion for immigrants, veterans, and individuals re-entering society after incarceration. At a time where social isolation and community fragmentation are on the rise, this framework is a timely response. It underscores how policies at the local and state levels can regenerate the social fabric of our communities by emphasizing civic opportunities, participation, and connection. The framework also highlights that these efforts are not just about welcoming newcomers or reintegrating returning citizens. They're about creating communities where everyone, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to thrive and participate fully in civic life. We're especially excited to share this work with you today because it addresses critical life transitions, whether it's veterans returning from service, formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrating into society, or newcomers finding their footing in new communities. This framework outlines actionable steps that local governments and organizations can take to bridge divides, build social capital, and create the enabling conditions that foster belonging and participation. In a few moments, you'll hear directly from Sam Pressler, the author of this policy framework, who will provide an overview of the research and its key findings on community integration. We're also fortunate to be joined by distinguished panels of leaders who bring decades of experience in promoting the inclusion of veterans, immigrants, and formerly incarcerated people in our communities. Their insights will help us explore both the shared opportunities and the unique challenges facing all of us who work in these communities. As we begin this important conversation, I encourage everyone to think about how these insights might apply in your own work and communities. I know that many of us joining today may have different levels of familiarity with the communities that we're talking about, whether it's immigrants, veterans, or formerly incarcerated individuals. But that in itself is a reminder of why events like these are so important. The more that we work to cross-pollinate, to partner, to build bridges across different groups, the closer we get to creating truly welcoming and inclusive communities for all. It's also a reminder that being an immigrant, a veteran, or a formerly incarcerated person cuts across race, religion, gender, and economic status. Today is about finding common ground and identifying concrete actions we can all take to build more inclusive and connected communities. So again, thank you all for being here today and for your commitment to fostering a more welcoming society. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sam Pressler, the author of the Connective Tissue Policy Framework. Sam, the floor is yours.
Awesome. I'm gonna start sharing my screen and get into it. Can you all see the screen? Good to go. Thank you so much, Daniel, for the introduction. The screen share handoff is always a dicey one, so I appreciate y'all's bearing with me. I'm Sam Pressler. As Daniel mentioned, I'm the author of this Connective Tissue Policy Framework, which is really around this big question: what's the role of government in strengthening connection in American communities? Before I jump into this, some of you on the call may know me, a lot of folks don't. I just want to share like what brought me to this work, and I'm actually going to start with this kind of middle funny picture here around my experience with community and my formative experience with that, which was kind of accidentally starting an organization called the Armed Services Arts Partnership, or ASAP, which is now the largest community arts organization in the country, serving veterans and their families. And that experience kind of showed me what I call think of as like the magic that happens in community, where you take, for us, we would take a group of people who maybe didn't know each other before a class or a workshop, and by the end of that 8 weeks are not only willing to support one another inside the classroom, but kind of showing up for one another unconditionally outside. And as I handed that organization off to a new executive director who I think is on this call, I really asked the question to myself of like, what just happened? Like, how did I, the civilian non-artist, become the head of this military arts organization? Unfortunately, through this research that I got to do as a fellow at Harvard, I had this aha moment where it's really, for me, the thing beneath the thing was this question of how do we connect, or how do we reconnect people to the relationships, the communities, the commitments that make our lives worth living. And it was through that question and that line of inquiry that I found myself in a lot of conversations early last year with policymakers who were starting to ask this question themselves and starting to think, that maybe the root cause of so many of the challenges in American life, be it, health outcomes and deaths of despair, be it democratic backsliding, be it economic immobility, was actually the weakening of our civic and our social lives. And there was this, sense and motivation to act. You saw people like the Surgeon General who put out his advisory on loneliness. You see people like Senator Murphy who've been doing work around this. But kind of the other side of that motivation was a sense that connection, social capital can be kind of squishy, kind of hard to define. And flowing from that, the space was underdeveloped, and there wasn't a clear sense of where do you begin? How do you actually take action around this? And so that's very much where this policy framework came in. We created this framework to provide policymakers with this principled, organized, actionable starting point for connection-focused policymaking. This is not the playbook that is the be-all, end-all, but it is intended to be a starting point. And so it was, for us, it was important to start with a set of principles around what can the role of policy be? What can the guiding principles for policy look like? And for us, we landed on three kind of high-level things. The first is policy can increase civic opportunities. And what we mean by that is the kind of supply side of social capital. Policy can help facilitate more accessible third places, more accessible groups, kind of activities, and programs. The second is participation. Policy can help boost participation. It can make things more participatory. It can target specific groups. It can remove barriers to participation. And then policy can play a role in increasing the connections that both enable and result from this type of participation. That could be overall types of connections. That could be connections across difference. And so with those principles in place, then there was a question for us is how do we take this really big thing, this really broad concept, and make it accessible? How do we kind of organize it and structure it to give people an entry point to jump in? And what we did is we organized 4 complementary chapters, one on foundational changes, one on community institutions, one on life transitions, and one on enabling conditions. And then within those chapters added 3 to 4 related sections. And so with that framework in place and that structure, we then okay, what does it look like to make this actionable? How do we take it from a way of viewing this work to something that policymakers can actually start moving on? And what we did is we organized it by kind of the level of government that can take action, federal to local, as well as philanthropy, and then also providing specific policy opportunities within each of those levels of what action could look like. And finally, basically on every page, we have a case study or an example of what that's looked like on the ground in certain places. So this slide kind of shows the breadth of what we included in the policy framework, starting with our foundational changes chapter, which includes things like measures and personnel, all the way through our enabling conditions, which is about these kind of things that occur outside of community, like the workplace and technology, but influence our experience of connection within community. Today, we're going to talk about the life transitions chapter, as Daniel alluded to, and specifically looking at community integration, and for this called the community integration of veterans, formerly incarcerated people, and immigrants. I'm going to start, I'm going to now get into that part of the framework, and it's going to be a very high level overview. I encourage you to dig in at a much deeper level, but I want to start with some initial framing. This came from my time working with the veteran population, but also working through a fellowship I had with Echoing Green with people like Kelly, who were working with formerly incarcerated people and immigrants, and recognized that there was actually this shared experience of transition and integration rather than kind of seeing this as purely population-specific issues. And today, I want to kind of pose what that could look like and potentially where policy and practice's role could be. To start, I want to lay the groundwork of kind of how, from my research and my work, I've seen the shared challenges and the shared needs of these populations, and maybe pose the opportunity for shared work around these populations. And so when we think of shared challenges, kind of two key components. The first is like recognizing that all of these groups are leaving a set of institutions, communities, and networks, set of purpose, set of identity, and they're entering a new place where they're asking, who am I now? Where do I belong? What's next? At the same time, they're entering communities that, as Bob Putnam and many others have written about, have fewer support structures, be they religious, communal, familial, neighborly, to help them navigate and move through these questions. I'll note that, and I've mentioned this with many of my veteran friends, immigrants and formerly incarcerated people often face even further additional challenges around stigma and distrust that complicate the experience of integration even more. But now with that, there's also this set of shared needs. And there's kind of at least two components that we've seen. First is the material supports, access to housing, access to employment, access to other social services. But the other is also the integration into these communal social support networks, whether it be peer-based with fellow veterans, fellow immigrants, or also part of the broader community into which you're entering. And so this leads to a set of questions. Is there an opportunity for cross-population welcoming field to develop that helps veterans, immigrants, and formerly incarcerated people integrate into their communities? And if so, what would it take to actually do that, whether it be cross-policy, philanthropy, or civic life? And so what's going to follow is going to be kind of three different areas where I see opportunity for shared work, some of which is already happening within its existing populations, but can actually come together. So the first is actually thinking about the programmatic component of it. And when I was doing this research and just from my past work, it seems to me there are kind of three types of programming that can support integration. The first is kind of peer-based programming. And so this is these initiatives that take someone who's already gone through the experience of integration and pairs them up or puts them in a small group with people who are currently going through that experience of integration, connecting them with resources, but also integrating them and providing them with community support. The second is this community circles idea. This picture is from Vermont's communities of support and accountability, or COSA, where you have welcome circles for a member who is integrating into a community from a group, and then community members who surround them and support them from a social support perspective, from navigating local resources, and also providing connections to opportunities for community involvement. The final programmatic piece is this neighborhood programming angle, which is a little bit less prevalent in the US, but in places like Australia, they actually do very well, which is there's a role of local government and philanthropy in providing basically micro grants for neighborhoods to promote welcoming in particular. So grants for welcome parties and welcome dinners for newcomers, welcome kits to help navigate life in the new community, sports leagues with integrating populations and folks who've been in the community, and kind of shared service projects and neighborhood service projects that bring folks who are coming to a community and who've been in the community to work shoulder to shoulder. But then even with those activities, there does need to be some personnel or kind of staff support to make this happen. And many of you on the call like maybe fall into one of these roles, working with immigrants or with formerly incarcerated people or with veterans, but thinking about having a staff member that's either focused on promoting all of the welcoming and integration of all of these integrating populations, or depending on the place, maybe it's a staff member who's focused on one specific population like veterans or immigrants or formerly incarcerated people. The second is not necessarily the staff level, but at the maybe voluntary or neighborhood level, where you can have liaisons, people who are in these positions that help facilitate the integration of newcomers into their communities. They can integrate them into these welcoming programs and supports, and at the neighborhood level, they can do some of the coordination of these neighborhood welcoming activities that we were talking about. The final piece is, if we're going to potentially cultivate this cross-population field of welcoming, experimentation at the local level is really good, but it's not going to be enough. Excuse me. There needs to be like actual field building opportunities. And here we see at least three examples as a starting point, definitely not an endpoint. But the first is the role of philanthropy in creating learning networks that break down silos between groups working with veterans, groups working with formerly incarcerated people, groups working with immigrants to kind of connect with and learn from one another. The government, particularly mayor's offices, governor's offices, the office of the president, can do similar work and leverage their convening and coordinating powers to bring these groups together, to learn from one another, to kind of surface supports for groups that maybe work with different kind of populations that have overlapping identities, like veterans who are also formerly incarcerated or immigrants who are also formerly incarcerated. And then the final piece is recognizing that this, like building a field of welcoming, will take work, it will take capacity. And there's a role for both philanthropy and the federal government to support the kind of cultivation of this field, whether it be funding the programs or activities, funding welcoming certification initiatives like what Welcoming America does, or actually providing trainings to kind of city leaders and frontline leaders to just become more welcoming and integration friendly places. And so the kind of overall vision is that we can actually learn from one another in a cross-population way and identify opportunities to potentially support multiple populations at the same time and not just view this as a siloed population-specific issue. This is a starting point, not an endpoint, and I'm really excited to bring in our panelists next. But right before I do, I just want to say, if you want to engage with the framework further, please feel free to read it, challenge it, build on it at our website, theconnectivetissue.us. Feel free to share it with other policymakers, researchers, practitioners who might be interested in the work. And please do follow up with me. I'm happy to meet, ask me questions, offer feedback, and let's identify opportunities to build on this work together. So with that, I want to bring in our panelists. I'm going to now do my screen share transition, which I knew would be difficult, and get to this amazing panel. So the first panelist that I'm really excited to introduce is Melissa Hughes. She's the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity for Portland, Maine, where she leads the city's efforts to help integrate immigrants into the community. Welcome, Melissa. The next I want to introduce is old friend Kelly Oriens, a law professor at the University of Virginia, where she also leads the school's decarceration and community reentry clinic. Welcome, Kelly. And then the last person, another old friend that I want to introduce is Kayla Williams. She's a U.S. Army veteran, author of multiple books about her military experience, and most recently, the former Assistant Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Welcome, Kayla. So as we begin the panel, I encourage you, as Daniel mentioned, to submit your questions via the Q&A feature. We're not going to have an official Q&A portion. Rather, I'm just going to do my best to incorporate your specific questions into the panel throughout the event. So don't save all your questions to the end. That's the key takeaway there. I'll also note that since this framework is focused on connection and social capital, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the social side of community integration rather than the material side during this discussion. So with that, I want to get into the panel. This first question is going to be for all of you. And so just to ground this conversation, if each of you can provide just a brief 1-minute overview of your work supporting the integration of whether it be veterans, immigrants, formerly incarcerated people, and supporting their integration into their communities. I'll maybe go with Kayla first, since I introduced you last, and then we can go to Kelly and Melissa.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sam. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on today and be a part of this really important and interesting conversation. As you mentioned, I'm an Army veteran. I served on active duty for 5 years. And after leaving military service and also becoming a caregiver to my combat wounded spouse, I used my GI Bill to go on to graduate school, spent time working at the Rand Corporation, doing research and analysis on service member and veteran mental health needs and programs available to support them. I also worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs, first running the Center for Women Veterans and later running the Office of Public and Intergovernmental Affairs, as you mentioned. Also spent some time at CNAS, the Center for New American Security, where I also did research in particular on state level benefits for veterans, which really vary quite substantially between the 50 states as well as among the US territories, and county level services available for veterans, because I've seen so many people focus at the national level and the philanthropic level, but really leave out those other elements of support that's available at the state and local level. And finished up recently by going back to RAND and continuing to do research. So again, happy to be here. My role has been more on the side of assessing and evaluating and doing research on what's out there and trying to raise awareness of national level rather than like direct boots on the ground community level delivery of services. So I hope that that'll be an interesting complement to your other speakers.
Awesome. Kelly, you want to jump in? Oh, you're on mute.
Hello, hi. Yeah, my name's Kelly. I currently wear day to day is a professor at University of Virginia School of Law. My work started in this space really when my dad transitioned home from prison, actually, and we existed really in silence in the community that we lived in. And so the theme of this panel is particularly resonant with me because I think that type of isolation is exactly what this type of conversation is designed to solve. And when I graduated from law school, I had the opportunity to help start a nonprofit organization in New Orleans, where the whole cornerstone of what we did, our credo was us helping us. And it was designed to connect people to the social capital that they need coming home from prison, that connects them to things like transitional housing, which we provided on site, financial services, ongoing community support, legal services, access to public benefits, and a social network that they would be able to stay involved in for years to come. And many of our alumni of the program went on to work for the organization or volunteer in some capacity. And I've taken the theory of that work here to UVA, where my students and I work with community-based organizations to help their clients and the people they serve solve problems that might otherwise disconnect them from the communities they're returning to, and help them better reintegrate and fully reintegrate after they've left prison.
Thanks, Kelly. Melissa, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Hugh. My role started, I am first generation immigrant from North Carolina originally, and my parents moved here when I was about 2 years old. So I was raised with the understanding of American systems and the barriers and challenges that immigrants face, whether you come with an accent or you don't know the language, or you are just trying to get a job or start your own business. And with that lens, I focus my work on curating specialty programming that causes more of an integration and community building. I got my undergrad at University of New England in medical biology and got my master's in public health. And then after that, I worked in tons of nonprofits, from mental health and behavioral challenges for young children to Planned Parenthood to Maine Medical Center, and et cetera, for years. And then I entered the municipal space with the master's in public health, understanding that public health crisis is a municipal problem at this point in our society, and it should be considered with that lens. So in the office, like I said, I curate specialty programs, but I also sit on the board for the Special Olympics of Maine and Maine Housing, and a lot of big, let's say, state boards that intersect with municipal and local work. And through that, I've been able to, one, assess how the data and outcomes should play out when it comes to big cities dealing with inequities and suffering from underrepresented communities, trying to create pipelines and pathways to success. And hopefully I can bring that insight to this conversation as we move forward.
Thanks, Melissa. So I want to jump right into this discussion and actually want to encourage you to potentially push back on some of the stuff that I said. So in the presentation, I suggested that veterans, immigrants, formerly incarcerated people have a set of shared challenges and needs. And all of you can respond to this, some of you if you want to, but I'm curious, does this framing resonate with you? And if not, I'm curious how, if at all, you'd reframe the challenges and needs that each of these groups face, both in terms of where they differ and where they potentially overlap.
You go ahead, Kayla.
I would just say that I think a key difference is that veterans are eligible for a vast array of services and supports that I think the other two groups are not. So I get free healthcare from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I was able to get really extremely generous education benefits after leaving active duty. I'm able to get government backing for home loans. So the availability of services and supports that were designed to help me reintegrate, but then also to thrive for the rest of my life. They're really, really generous compared to, I think, almost any other group in the United States. The other thing that I'll just throw out there, I think, you frame this as talking about transitions, which I think is really interesting, and where we have, maybe a window to help shape the trajectory of how folks are going to go. And these identities also can stay with us forever, right? So like I needed help with integration or reintegration into a new community after leaving the military, but my veteran status sticks with me forever. And I think to an extent that is true of the other groups as well. And so thinking about ways in which this conversation is relevant in that like period of transition and how long does that last versus thinking, for decades into the future, it could be, just worth kind of digging into more deeply as you continue your work.
Yeah, I think in many ways it resonates, but I'll start with a couple ways that it doesn't, and it's building off of something Kayla said. Within the criminal legal system, we have these specialty courts, and one of the specialty courts we have is Veterans Court, and then we have this other court called Reentry Court. And at a core level, Veterans Court is designed to draw you in deeper to this identity that you'll carry with you your entire life of being a veteran, and meant to celebrate veteran status. There's these veterans courts around the country. They'll even, change what's on the wall when it's Veterans Docket time to celebrate the identity of having served your country, versus when you have reentry court, it's meant to distance you from that group and distance you from that identity. And the identity as a formerly incarcerated person, certainly being one that carries stigma, is one that you're meant to strip yourself of versus celebrating. And certainly veterans are not universally celebrated, and there's certainly stigma and abuse that is carried, but painting with broad strokes, right? We celebrate the idea of being a veteran. And so I think that certainly is a distinct difference in how we carry that. Certainly we've seen, especially the rhetoric has become incredibly heated and incredibly violent within the immigrant community, and the blame that we put and the association that we make with immigrants contributing to the rising cost of housing or taking jobs. And so I think that identity, the relationship between the identity is really different, but there are several more things that unite it. I think there's a shared experience of trauma that people, whether you immigrated here or whether you are returning from active duty or whether you're returning from incarceration, there's the trauma that you're carrying with that. Often untreated trauma is a shared experience that binds. Also within the role in the economy in different ways, especially immigrants and formerly incarcerated people often get pushed to the margins of the workforce and are pushed into the informal economy, less safe employment. For different reasons, right? It's illegal to hire an undocumented person. And I'm, again, painting in very broad brushstrokes because immigration is certainly a very complicated legal area, but it would be illegal to hire someone who is undocumented, but people are certainly working when they're undocumented, but they don't carry the same protections. Similarly, formerly incarcerated people are prohibited from being employed by certain companies and in certain industries, and they get pushed to the margins, get pushed to unsafe employment. And then I've with some of my formerly incarcerated veteran clients, they talk about licensing and experience that they gain and have while they're overseas or while they're working in the armed services, and that doesn't translate in the economy. I think immigrants as well will bring accreditations and degrees from different countries that then don't transfer into the economy here in the US. And similarly, people will earn trades and earn skills while they're incarcerated, and that won't translate as well. So there's a lost in translation issue when it comes to their employability.
Awesome. Thanks,
Yeah,
Kelly.
and
Melissa, jump in. Yeah, please.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you both just said it so well, brilliant people on this panel today. And just to sum it up, I think what you're doing is probably, again, creating another entry point in ways through alignment. And alignment starts a conversation because you do want people to see alignment in a very divisive culture. And once you start seeing that alignment, I think it's extremely important to highlight the differences or the challenges, barriers that society has created or that is economically there for this specific demographic. Though we do heavily work with our immigrant population, we are the Office of Economic Opportunity for all. And in that case, what we also see, for example, if we take our homeless population, is this umbrella conversation that on surface level looks good, but actually kind of does more harm. When you place everybody under the umbrella of homelessness, you forget to make a distinction of what type of homelessness that you have. And then you create this big entity that nobody can solve, right? It's too big, it's too daunting, which is similar to what's happening here, this huge alignment. So how do we solve for this huge alignment? Well, we solve by naming the different types of focuses under the alignment. So our homeless population, yes, they're all homeless, but we have transient homeless population, we have chronically homeless population, we have intergenerational homeless populations, and we have your couch surfers that you don't notice are homeless, but they do exist. And then addressing their needs specifically is part of the alignment. And I think what you're doing here is a good job of finding that alignment, but we have to make strong distinctions of these specific demographics in there.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's an interesting tension here, which we're not gonna have time to dive into. This could be an entire series of like how these identities can be like so totalizing and flattening that they eliminate kind of the nuance of the experience. And I'm not going to dive into that, but I just wanted to name that because that is something that comes up in this. I think I want to move a little into this question around social integration. I want to make sure we kind of touch on this at in the heart of the panel. And this is a question that I want to open up for each of you to respond to. I think as we go later, we may, pick and choose specific questions. But to start, I'm curious, like for each of you, have there been examples or policies, practices, programs, I would say particularly at the state and local level, that have been successful in facilitating the kind of social integration of the population with whom you've worked? And I know there's a lot of practitioners and policymakers on the call. I want to like surface these as kind of a starting point or an anchor point for the conversation. And maybe Melissa, you can go back to you since you went last.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about two different types of integration. So there's the social integration, which people find to be social inclusion, acts of belonging, welcomability, things like that. And then there's like concrete practices, which pushes folks to do certain acts that leads to organic inclusion. And that's strong policy making. For example, during COVID, there was a crisis. There was a housing crisis here, and I'm sure there's a housing crisis nationwide. But the housing crisis for this particular city that I was working with was not kind to people of color. So the housing that they were put in weren't up to standard. They were being exploited, et cetera. The state decided to put forth housing navigators, one, because it was hard to find housing, and two, they wanted some type of community liaison on the ground. When they sent and put out for these housing navigators to be inserted into cities, this particular municipality took them in under my office, and they placed them in general assistance. And the policy there created was that these housing navigators had to work with folks that are solely on general assistance. and they had to model what it would look like for a real estate agent. So that means they have to work between the city's code enforcement to enter into these private landlord homes to make sure that they were sufficient enough to be lived in. And they have to create landlord-tenant relations and bridge that gap of integration or fear by letting the landlord know this is the tenant that you'll receive, and letting the expectations for the tenant be known from the landlord as well, and serve as an intermediary. When they did that, they noticed that a lot of the tenants that they received needed life skills, which put them at a disadvantage to receiving homes, or created more complicated problems than necessary. And so what they were tasked to do was create a life skills program, some type of case management program for the tenant as they entered, and did a 3-time checkup. So every 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, they would check in until the final year, which the tenant would be left on their own. What happened was the community integrated through a policy very organically, and both needs were met. And it reduced the tension from newcomers entering in and taking space and not knowing how to deal with the landlord. The social inclusion part is feel-good projects that we pilot with people. They're almost like social experiments that we see on reality TV today, and seeing how people bridge gaps and do that organically. So in my office, we put forth the National Natural Helpers Program. We created the program as a fellowship style to create this hub of inclusion. We have 12 different representatives from all underrepresented protected classes. So we could have a veteran, an elder aged person, a young youth, somebody coming from a Latinx population, from an African population. And it's basically the United Nations of DEI at the table. During the 4 months, they are tasked to have impact in their represented communities. And we source them with resources that we believe will create a pipeline for success for themselves and their represented communities. Now, because we are not expertise in their communities, we put that responsibility on these community leaders, and they don't look like your average ones. Some could be policymakers, and some could be just the mom who understands that neighborhood policing is of high importance in her community and she wants to make a difference. But this pool of creative minds at a table for, like you mentioned before, for 4 months straight, working together to create these impacts while being funded through micro grants, created one of the biggest data outcomes that we've seen from a fellowship style in our city. And I think those are 2 forms of social inclusion examples that we've done so far.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe Kelly, you want to jump in?
Sure. That's so interesting. And I was taking a lot of notes on that, Melissa. So thank you for your service and everything y'all are doing. I think one of the ways that we have seen some success in Louisiana is what's called offender non-association policies. They exist in about half the states. They are not enforced in Louisiana, but they're policies that prevent formerly incarcerated people from associating with each other, people with felony records from associating with each other. They have a fascinating legal history insofar as the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that infringing on people's rights, freedom of association, is entirely constitutional because the justification by the government is it promotes safety. And at a simple level, I think we could appreciate the idea that if people are engaging in antisocial behavior, we don't want people engaging in antisocial behavior in groups. But given what we know about how policing and mass incarceration operates, what these policies do is they divide communities and they divide families. And so on a level with housing and also employment, people are prohibited from living with each other, from living with family members. If another member of the family has a felony conviction, you're not allowed to be on that lease together, not allowed to live in that home together. And it would actually violate your parole and send you back to prison. And then on a social level as well, those types of policies would have prevented an organization like the First 72 Plus, where I used to work, from even existing, because the cornerstone of that organization was formerly incarcerated people helping each other make that transition home. And it's based on, from a social sciences perspective, what we call retroflexive reformation, really the cornerstone of a lot of AA or NA groups, the idea that people who are further along in their recovery will reach back and pull the next person up, and that re-entrenches both of their recovery journeys. And And it's quite successful. It's been, it's been studied over and over and over again that this is a successful model for a lot of people when it comes to recovery, whether that's recovery is from addiction or transitioning home from prison or co-occurring issues that you might be dealing with. Another way these manifest are gang injunctions, which are prevalent in Southern California. But there are these policies that just literally divide communities, and it prevents people from accessing the physical capital they need, like housing, but also, and perhaps even to an even greater degree, is that social capital. And so we push within New Orleans, that people embrace coming home and refinding that community that they left back at the penitentiary when they got released from prison. They came back, they experienced extreme isolation that they were not experiencing while they were incarcerated. And that's not an endorsement for overcrowded prisons or prisons in general, but the idea that you're living amongst a community and then you're separated from that community and you come back and you're not able to rejoin that community. So I think abolishing offender non-association policies is the most basic level that we could start to ensure that folks coming home have access to social capital.
Yeah, Kelly, that's really interesting, and I think showcases, someone who worked with veterans for a very long time, how different the treatment of veterans and formerly incarcerated people are. Like, you could literally never imagine a government policy that prevents veterans from associating with one another and their families. Or maybe Kayla, push back on that if you could find that. I also just want to bring out a point that you said that overlaps with a question we got in the chat, which is, are there other populations for which this kind of element of community integration and thinking about re-entering community can be applied? And I think this, one that really comes across is kind of people in recovery, and how do you integrate people in recovery back into communities? And you kind of touched on that, and there's a lot of really interesting examples of what that could look like. No, Kayla, to you, anything, I'm happy to repeat the question, or you have anything you want to add?
I think you're asking for examples that seem effective. Is that right?
Yeah, and particularly around this kind of social and community integration piece.
Yeah, and I think you're interested particularly in things happening at like maybe the local level and with a government focus. And I'll say that on the veteran side of things, I think most of these programs are more on the philanthropic side. And you mentioned one that you yourself founded. There are a lot of others, some of which partner or collaborate with government in some really interesting ways. Some of them, like Team Rubicon, where they activate veterans to use the training they got in the military to do disaster relief, and they'll collaborate with local governments to go into communities to help rebuild after natural disasters, for example. You have organizations like Travis Manion Foundation also trying to activate folks to do volunteer work. One that I think is really interesting right now is the Vote, where they're recruiting veterans to work as poll workers nationwide, and it's collaborating with local government to try to activate the, as Kelly mentioned, there is like the opposite of stigma in many cases with veterans. Veterans are often quite respected, and so trying to like draw on that respect and trust that veterans have to help restore faith in elections by getting veterans to be involved in that way. And you see, and sometimes you'll have local, state and federal government that their role in this is providing grants or providing space or providing ways to collaborate. I think another interesting element that I've seen happen at both the state and federal level are trying to reduce some of the barriers to taking advantage of spaces. So what I mean very specifically here is foregoing the revenue that governments would otherwise gain by charging admission to things like state parks, national parks, and make it easier for veterans to access those spaces. Same with things like hunting and fishing licenses, and even use of community-owned golf courses. So trying to facilitate in a very indirect way some of those social connections by opening up a space to use publicly owned spaces where social connections can be developed versus trying to forge them directly. And I'll note that on the federal level, the Veterans Health Administration is really interested in this question. They're trying to identify ways you mentioned peer support already. That's one thing that's done, but also of social prescribing, where you might actually prescribe patients to be involved in organizations and to form social connections, and trying to activate veterans to communicate with one another, either through phone call check-ins or writing postcards. And I think an element that could be worth thinking through is, what if you have folks who may have barriers to in-person connection, whether transportation, especially in more rural areas, or mobility issues, are there other ways that we can try to form that connection? And we think a lot, maybe in this exact moment, we're on a virtual platform, but that doesn't work for everyone. There can be problems with connectivity. Not everybody's comfortable with it. So even thinking like really low tech, sending postcards to people to help them feel less isolated, feel more connected to one another. There are a lot of interesting and innovative ideas that folks can experiment with.
Thanks, Kayla. Yeah, and I think in your response, I think you're getting at a tension across this entire framework, which is, where does the role of government end and where does the role of community begin? And I think there is, something that I've heard from blue states and red states alike, or blue policymakers and red policymakers alike, is a recognition that government can go too far and actually play the role of some of these intermediary groups or associations that actually should be the role of citizens and communities. And so thinking about the VA, as an institution that has its footprint all over the United States and abroad, where does the VA's role end and where does the community's role begin? I know is a constant question. Looking at time, and I saw a question in the chat that actually overlapped with one of the questions that I had, and want to ask it directly. This is one that if you have an answer for, please jump in. If you don't, no need for everyone to respond. But someone in the chat asked about kind of the intersecting or overlapping identities or experiences, being a veteran who is also an immigrant, or a formerly incarcerated person who's also a veteran. I know Kelly and Melissa, you've even alluded to this in your past answers. And so I'm curious, how you've either seen existing policies and practices designed to support the integration of those overlapping or intersecting groups, or where you see the potential of kind of policy and practice to support those groups that may have that overlap on the Venn diagram of those experiences.
We have a client that we're representing right now who's a veteran of the Vietnam War, and he came home years before PTSD was a diagnosis, and committed a violent crime and went to prison. And our experience working with him has been one where we see that your veteran, the celebration of you being a veteran, has its limits once you cross some threshold, right? And you've lost, and even when we're able to demonstrate that the relationship between violent behavior that you engaged in was related to your service and to the lack of support and to the trauma you endured, the lack of treatment you got when you came home, that veteran status, and that has its limits. And I think that's been a really frustrating process for us as well. Certainly within the veterans community, the support has not waned. But when it comes to the officials who make a decision about whether or not he gets to come home, we're having a hard time persuading them, or having a hard time getting them to appreciate the relationship between the two things. And in some ways, I think it forces us to confront the larger issues that veterans face, right, when they come home, and the consequences of foreign policy and of various things that put people in situations that cause serious trauma to their lives. And it's it feels like this unspoken, or not often spoken enough and appreciated enough crisis that we're dealing with. And then similarly, on the other side, we have a client of ours who is undocumented, and if he's released from prison, he could be deported to El Salvador, if we're able to be successful with that release. And I think within that, where we face some trouble is being able to partner with some of our colleagues in the legal services for immigrants community, because there's such a shortage of services to begin with, that being able to spare some of those short resources on someone who also committed a crime of violence and caused harm in the community, but the relationship between his there's a relationship between his experience, why his family fled El Salvador, what that set him up for when he arrived here and had a lack of support and opportunities to be able to make a living legally, and fell into the wrong crowd. And being able to appreciate how these things are interconnected, and how it's not just a celebration of the American dream or some idea, a fairy tale about how these experiences exist, but it can lead to circumstances where there's real harm that occurred. And being able to appreciate the struggles that veterans carry, that immigrants carry, and how that can manifest in a way that doesn't result in a fairy tale or the American dream that we like to prescribe. But that those folks still need help, that they might be even more representative of why this work in for these communities is so important. Then it will make
So,
I just
Melissa,
wanted to add,
I want you to jump in, and then we'll go to the last question. So go ahead. I just wanted to name that.
yeah, one more thing to add on to what Kelly said, and just to be very frank, I know this nonprofit leader who also served in the military, and she was originally from Sudan, but she made a very clear statement that says, if you don't know, she was like, I'm Black before you know I'm in the military, right? Like, I'm a Black female before I'm in the military. I have to tell you that I'm a former veteran. And what she was alluding to was, when she came back, she was received as who she was, an immigrant and a Black female in America. And then she would have to tell her story to receive some type of celebration. And she was triggered a lot more than her counterparts in her mind, right? Like, her experiences in America's society was way more triggering and brought her back to places where she was when she was in the military. At more times than she said her counterparts would. So she ended up fighting for, one, her community as just a Black female in America who is an immigrant, and creating space in the outdoors for therapy, and also the veteran community and creating space in the outdoors for therapy as a way to still fix the traumas that she was enduring. What we noticed was that intersection, right? And I think especially when we're giving out grants from the state or from the federal government, highlighting the importance of that convening of the intersections that people are facing when providing grants is extremely important. It's almost like there needs to be not necessarily a box, but the storytelling part of, like, who you're servicing and why, and break that down. So we put out things, for example, for racial equity, but she's just not her race. She also has this lived experience that is very unique to a separate demographic. And how do we align? And I think we currently have some policies that dig deep into that, but we could do an extremely better job of when we're asking for grants and we're writing these prompts to highlight that intersection as well.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm looking at time. I want to do a kind of, these things always go by quicker than we want. This is kind of rapid round, like 30 seconds, kind of an immediate step or two that either a policymaker, a funder, a community group, a neighbor can take to support the community integration of veteran, immigrant, formerly incarcerated people, all of the above. I'll start with you, Kayla. You're giving me a troubled look. I could go back to you.
In 30 seconds or less, that's really tough. And you also gave like a huge group of who could be doing this. I'd say one area that's ripe for additional intervention, maybe from multiple levels, is coming together to define terms that to do better evaluation, right? Like, what are we measuring? How are we going to measure success? And get everybody to use the same way to measure success so that you can better compare which organizations are effective. That's one gap that I've seen.
Melissa, you go for it.
Yeah, I mean, 30 seconds. One, just analyze the policies that you already have and see if, like Kayla says, it's meeting the outcome that you want, because we get so fixated on doing the same things over and over again because it's comfortable and convenient, that we just forget to go back and just reassess what are the outcomes that we want, and then trying something a little different. Also, think of the unusual suspects when we think of government partnerships and stakeholders. So we have a partnership with the Regional Chamber of Commerce, who has business leaders and has people who employ tons of populations. And we're holding this formally informal networking opportunity where before we do it, we target populations who might have a barrier to social networking, which would be your reentry population, or maybe your veterans population who haven't had the experience in social networking. And we teach workshops on that before they hit the entry point in this whole event, where they can meet somebody who shares in alignment with them, or has the job that they want, or has advice to give them, and create an opportunity for growth that way.
Awesome. Kelly, you're on mute.
Policies and laws that prohibit people with felony convictions from associating with each other, from where they can live, from where they can work, that notify the community when they come back into when they're released from prison, have a chilling effect on they give us this illusion that we're doing something to keep our community safe, when in actuality they're doing the exact opposite, and they're keeping communities divided, which keep our communities less safe, prevent our communities from protecting themselves. And so I think all policies, all laws that prohibit the full reintegration of formerly incarcerated people is not only just going to keep that community isolated, it's also going to keep us from exploring real solutions for how we promote health and safety where we live.
Awesome. And I'll do my quick pitch, which is one, to check out the policy framework, of course. But two, I think what this surfaced in this conversation, which is both some real shared opportunities and some really significant differences. And I think recognizing at least what I know the veteran space is going through, perhaps even some other spaces, is how resource constrained they are becoming. The opportunity to identify shared work and potentially even do some of this type of convening on the ground in local communities around opportunities to support one another, whether in government or in civic life, feels like something that could be low-hanging fruit to bring forward. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Daniel for some closing words on Welcoming America's behalf. And thank you again to Welcoming America for hosting this awesome event.
No, thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Special shout out to Anthony on our team for all of the logistics on the back end to make this event possible. And of course, a heartfelt thank you to our panelists, Melissa, Kelly, Kayla, and to our moderator, Sam, for sharing your time, your expertise, and your insights with us. We hope that this discussion today has sparked new ideas and inspired you to continue building more inclusive and connected communities. Let's take the knowledge shared here and turn it into action in our own work. I'm looking forward to continuing this important work. We will be sharing the recording in the next few days. So again, thank you for everyone joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you.